the Holy Gospel. Feels like wood. This feels like vinyl. This sounds like metal. This feels like skin. My senses tell me that there's a difference between these things, that there's something solid in each of them, yet they have a different texture and a different form. That's what my senses tell me. Physics tells me that even though I think this is really solid, it's not. I mean, physics, if you look at the space between the atoms and the electrons and protons and neutrons all spinning around, there's actually more space here than there is substance, according to physics. So this really isn't solid. It's like mostly just air, even though it feels to me like it's solid. And if you go to the subatomic level, like smaller than neutrons and electrons and protons, as you know, subatomic physicists try to explain what's going on there, they fundamentally are often very baffled by what's going on at the very smallest scale. And for a lot of physicists, they tell us that the best explanation really is God. They don't have any other good explanation other than that God somehow makes it happen. When Paul was in Athens, there were two schools of thought, two major schools, the Epicureans and the Stoics. And the Stoics believed that God was everywhere, in everything, was present all over, right? Everything ultimately was God. They were pantheists. And so when they looked at this, they said, this is God. God is here. And God is here. And God is here. And their philosophy kind of stemmed from that and flew from that. The Epicureans, on the other hand, were like, no, it's just wood. And that's just vinyl. And you're just skin, right? And so there's this big debate raging in Athens when Paul arrives there. I mean, you've got one crowd of people who are saying, no, God is everywhere. God is in everything. It is within God that we live and move and have our being, and we too are his offspring. We're children of God. We're part of the divine. The divine is in me, and the divine is in you. And the Epicureans are like, yeah, no, not so much. You get what you see, right, ultimately. I think Paul probably loved the debate, and he entered into these discussions with them, and they were like, who is this babbler? What's going on? Paul had spent many days in Athens waiting for his companions. He was on one of his missionary journeys, and as he looked around, it was a city this was a religious city. I mean, religion was everywhere. There were shrines and temples to all kinds of gods and divinities, the Parthenon, right? There was a huge marble statue of Athena in the Parthenon. You can go in there and just the sheer size and grandeur was supposed to invoke this sense of the divine, right? And what was going on. And you go to, there were, shrines and temples to Zeus and Apollo and, Bacchus and, gods and deities from other foreign lands. And people were doing rituals as a way of kind of appeasing the gods and succoring the gods' favor. Paul was watching all of this and listening to these debates, and he was bringing with him his own sense of his own Jewish identity and his newfound Christian identity into this, polytheistic mix of everything that was going on. And he had stuff to say. He had words that he had his own sense of God. And part of what he wanted to say is, you guys are getting it wrong, or I think your gods are too small. And they're like, what? Haven't you seen Athena in the Parthenon? Haven't you seen the Parthenon? And Paul is like, yeah. Your gods are too small. You feel like you control them. You feel like you make your own gods. And you feel like you can manipulate them. Your gods are smaller than you are, or else they're made in your own image, right? They're just like you. Paul's like, you need a God that's bigger than you. You need a God, that's not created in your image. And he starts talking about the Jewish Christian understanding of God, where he's like, well, no, actually, rather than God being created in your image, you are created in the image of God. You're a template, right? And God, it's God who gives you life and breath and being. It's God who has fashioned you in the same way that you're fashioning your idols, right? And the problem is that you fashion your idols out of the stuff that the one true God makes. God makes the stone. God makes the metal. God makes you. God is bigger than you. And what's curious is like he's been reading the Stoics, he's been debating them, he's been reading their poets, and so he quotes them. He quotes Epimenides, and he says, yeah, it is within God that you live and move and have your being. And you too are his offspring. I mean, that second quote is from this Greek poet Erotus, who wrote a poem 300 years before Christ was even born, and it's all about Zeus and how Zeus is everywhere, and Zeus is in the marketplace, and Zeus is in the streets, and Zeus is in you, and Zeus is in me. And then Erotus goes on, spends the rest of the time reflecting on the zodiac, and it's all about the zodiac and the stars and how you can do astrology. Paul was reading this, and he found truth in it. Right? Or he used it as a way of communicating some sort of deeper spiritual understanding of like, actually, no, yeah, you're right. God is everywhere, and you are created in God's image. But part of what Paul wanted to say is, and fundamentally, you're not God. And there's something liberating about that, about being able to know that you aren't God. I mean, Paul seemed to resonate more with the Stoics than he did with the Epicureans. He doesn't quote any Epicurean philosophers. But, unlike Stoicism, which is pantheistic and believes that God is in everything, I think Paul wanted to maintain what he felt was really important about love. If you believe that I am God and you are God and everything is God, then what love means is basically getting rid of the self and getting rid of your own ego and finally recognizing our similarity with each other. Which is what love would look like in a pantheistic system. It's that ultimately, I love you because you are me, basically. And the Jewish sense and Christian sense of love has been much different than that. There's always been this sense of a need for a self and another. Martin Buber, who's a Jewish philosopher and theologian, captures this in his great book, I and Thou, where he looks at that moment of what happens when there is genuine love between a self and another, between an I and a thou, between a lover and a beloved. And there needs to be space between them so that the one who is loving can delight in the other, and the one who is being loved can delight in the lover. And there's this dynamic reciprocity and mutuality that's happening that creates a kind of synergy and energy to love, which is the stuff of life. And that can happen not just between humans, but it can happen between us and the divine as well. So that for Paul, I think, is what's liberating about being able to say, no, actually, you're not God. There's a difference between the creature and the creator. And it's important to affirm that so that you can actually have love, so that you can be in love, so you can experience being loved by the creator, and that you can love each other and love each other well. Similar kinds of themes are actually playing out in our gospel text where Jesus is with his disciples, and it's this long discourse that happens on the Passover, and we read part of it last week, and we're reading more today, and Jesus is about to leave, and his disciples are upset, and Jesus says, don't worry, I'm not going to leave you orphaned. I will leave with you an advocate, the Spirit, and the Spirit will abide with you, and the Spirit will be in you. It's this profound sense of, gosh, actually, you know what? God is close. And the Spirit of God has not left. The Spirit of God is there, abiding with you and even abiding in you. Like it's as close as your breath. The ruah, the pneuma, the Spirit, the breath, God's breath. When God breathed into Adam, God breathes God's breath into Adam. That's how close the Spirit is. It's that breath within you. But that breath is not God. You are not God, right? Yeah, there's a distinction between you and the Spirit of God within you. And Jesus goes on to say, I'm going to the Father, and I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. I was like, what is that supposed to mean, right? Again, there's this profound kind of sense of interconnection. I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. I mean, that you could conflate that, and you could make it out that what Jesus is saying here is that somehow the divinity is, I am in the divinity, and the divinity is in you, and you are in the divinity with me, and we're all part of this divinity, right? Which you can see how that quickly eases into a kind of pantheism. And I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. But I think Jesus does want to communicate that kind of intimacy, that kind of communion, that kind of intersubjectivity. And that's part of what it's saying. But it's saying that actually if you want to experience love and know love, know that it is close. It is that close, and yet you don't stop being yourself. Our experience of human sexuality is, in some sense, one of the most profound experiences of intimacy and connection. The two become one flesh, right? And there's a way in which energetically and psychically and emotionally and spiritually there and physically there's this intertwining of bodies, and there's this sense of, at its best, of intimacy and communion and union. And yet, the two don't stop being two, right? The two don't stop being themselves. There's a balance, there's a tension there. And that's what I hear in this, is that these texts there's a desire to kind of say, hey, God is near. And yet you don't stop being yourself. Right? This isn't some sort of, you don't get lost. You don't have to be God. You don't have to bear that burden, that you actually get to be yourself. I mean, the wood still gets to be wood, and the vinyl still gets to be vinyl, and your flesh still gets to be flesh. And yet God, who loves you, right, who desires to take all the stuff of this life, all the pain and the suffering and the experience of our lives, and make it into something that is new and beautiful and created into new life, which is what the whole Easter story is all about. And that was Paul's message. That's why Paul was there in Athens. And it was that bit about God being able to take all the stuff of our life and make it into something new, that part about resurrection, part about Jesus' resurrection, that somehow God enters, the part of the story of Jesus is that he enters into human experience, our own lived experience, and in order to redeem it and save it. That's the part that the Athenians apparently had difficulty with. And I don't have a good way to end this, so that's just what I'm going to leave it right there today. Knowing that we live in that tension. We live in that tension of like, okay, what's our experience telling us? At one level, what do our senses tell us? But yet we have these other lived, deeper experiences, right? It's not just our senses that perceive reality. It's our hearts, it's our souls, it's our spirits. Amen.